Hi everyone, welcome to this tutorial about international trade. In this tutorial, I will first talk about Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage. I will present some conditions under which this theory is going to be limited, at least its results are going to be limited. Then I will go over the case of an export subsidy, and I will look at the impact of an export subsidy on the different surpluses, the same way I showed the impact of an import tariff on a country. Finally, I will talk about the effect of an import tariff when it is imposed by a small open economy. In the lecture, I talked about the impact of an import tariff on a big country. There is a difference with a small country, and this is what we are going to cover here. First, let's start with Ricardo's comparative advantage theory. Ricardo's theory of trade, although it holds powerful insights, has been widely criticized. Ricardo himself acknowledged the limits of his theory as its conclusions depend heavily on the assumptions made. Like any model, the results depend on the assumptions. Then it's all about knowing or deciding whether these assumptions are reasonable or not. Explain how each of the following conditions would change the results of his theory. First of all, inputs are mobile. Well, if inputs are mobile, as in labor and capital can freely flow across countries, then it could be advantageous to produce both goods in the country that has an absolute advantage in their production. If you remember the model seen in the lecture, Portugal had an absolute advantage in the production of wine and cloth. Capital and labor of England could be used in Portugal. Nowadays, many countries have signed regional trade agreements like the European Union, and that would allow such a phenomenon to happen. English labor and capital could flow to Portugal, where those inputs would be rewarded, and then Portugal will be the one producing both goods. So, capital and labor can freely cross borders inside regional trade agreements, and so some countries can then specialize, not necessarily in the production of the good they have a comparative advantage for, but maybe the production of the good they have an absolute advantage for. What if goods can be produced in one country, but not another? Some goods might not be able to be produced in some countries, which might justify why these countries are importing them. A typical example, France probably is not able to grow coconuts or pineapples, or maybe Sweden. Of course, nowadays it's still possible to produce them under very specific conditions, but it is not easily feasible. In this case, there is no such thing as a comparative advantage, since a country cannot produce some of the goods. So we can expect the country that can produce the good to do so because there will be a demand coming from abroad. But that is not guaranteed either. In Ricardo's original model, both countries are able to produce both goods. Now, they are able to produce them with different levels of productivity, but they are able to produce them. If a country is not able to produce a good for one reason or another, then it will have to import. This means that there's going to be a demand for that good, and countries that can produce this good then will face not only a domestic demand, but also a foreign demand. In this case, it makes sense that these countries produce that good since there is such a high demand. Now, something that Ricardo did not talk about in his theory is the notion of risk. Countries, like individuals, are subject to risks. That could be natural disasters, financial crises, economic crisis of any sort, wars, and so on and so forth. Once you include risk in this theory, then specializing in the production of some goods might not necessarily be the most efficient choice. If a country specializes in agricultural products due to their comparative advantage or endowment in land or manual labor force, for instance, the country importing this agricultural product is subject to a big risk. Think about a natural disaster. If a natural disaster hits the country, the other country who is not producing these necessary goods will starve. In the world we live now, well, it is always possible to turn to another country. After all, there are many countries and we haven't met disasters of a world level yet. Well, not at least natural disasters such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and so on. Now, think about the COVID-19 pandemic. France was not equipped in masks nor sanitizing equipment when the pandemic hit. So, in March 2021, as the country was on lockdown, the French government was trying to order masks from abroad because the country was not producing enough. So, if you rely on another country to provide the goods that you need, there is a risk that that country is not able to provide those goods. There could be a natural disaster, or simply that country might decide to sell their goods to another country than yours. In the case of France, there were 60 millions of masks in the plane as the plane was about to take off and go to Paris, when the United States made a better offer and the plane instead flew to the United States. France, that day, lost a deal on the masks. The country, France, stayed in lockdown for a bit longer and eventually they were able to equip everybody. But there was a moment where even healthcare workers were not provided sufficiently enough sanitizing and protective equipment. That is the risk. If you rely on other countries, but those countries are also hit by risks, then you are exposed. If you are a country that doesn't produce any food, you need to make sure that you can always rely on somebody to get some food. If it's another type of crisis, like a sanitary crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, make sure that your country has enough sanitizing equipment, any health-related equipment, needles for vaccines, and so on and so forth. Imagine, for instance, that there are not enough vaccines being produced in the world, then there is going to be a trade war between countries. Those countries are going to fight to figure out which is going to get the vaccines. That is a terrible outcome. So, even if France doesn't have a comparative advantage in the production of masks or sanitizing equipment or vaccines, maybe it has an incentive to produce some just in case one day it falls short. Another feature that would threaten the conclusions of Ricardo's theory is what happens if some countries are underdeveloped. In class, I talked about gains from trade as a general increase in total surplus, but when I talk about the general increase, that could also imply a decrease in surplus for some people or some firms. Think about an underdeveloped country. An underdeveloped country might specialize in the production of a good that is not prone to development or innovation, or a good where little value added is produced. In particular, I am thinking of agricultural goods. Those are goods where little value is being added to the production, so it is difficult for this industry to flourish as profits are generally pretty low. As a result, that industry might not develop sufficiently to raise standards of living. Workers might still get pretty much the same wage, income might not increase so much, so not so much consumption, and then not so much production. As an example, think about the cotton industry in African countries. Many African countries have been growing cotton for a very long time, and they are trading this cotton with developed countries. Well, cotton prices are sometimes imposed below production costs. Well, that's another debate why this happens, but there are different things that come into play, and many cotton industry workers still live under the poverty line. The problem with this situation is, well, that the industry cannot flourish. It is still selling its products to developed countries, but at a rate which is way too low for workers to get a decent standard of living. And it prevents the whole industry to develop further, maybe acquire better tools, invest in some production capacities, or overall at the economy level, push development forward. Remember that governments tax in order to fund the creation of public goods, infrastructure, to operate redistribution and exercise regalian functions. If they do not receive enough tax money from citizens and firms, then it is also difficult for governments to make investments to develop further. So some industries are low value added industries. So those are not industries that a country can rely on if it wants to develop. Some countries, I'm thinking about the four Asian dragons in the 80s, 90s. Those were China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. Knew a huge development with huge growth rates because they went from industries with little value added, like textile industry, and as they develop, they invested in other industries that have higher value added. And nowadays, countries like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and China are producing very high value added goods. They produce high-tech goods such as, well, you name it, TV, computers, phones, smartphones, and so on and so forth. Those are good with high value added, and that happened because these countries, these governments invested in different industries with more and more value added over time, so they could grow and develop. Now, let's think about a country that is exporting a good as opposed to importing the good. So, in order to reinforce its exporting ability or to develop its industry further, the government decides to subsidize the exports of that good. So, every time a firm from that industry sells a unit of the good abroad, it gets a subsidy from the government. Let's look at the effect of an export subsidy on that country. First off, we need to look at the equilibrium price before the subsidy is in place. So we're going to start with a world price equal to PW, for which the country exports. So that means that at this price, the country has a higher supply than demand, and this excess supply will meet foreign demand. An export subsidy will have the effect of shifting the export curve downwards, because this represents a reduction in the cost of producing the good that is being exported. So, the supply curve in the home country is not going to change because the government is not subsidizing those goods. The government will subsidize the goods which are sold abroad. So, for a given price, firms are willing to sell a higher quantity abroad, but in the home country, nothing changes. The first three graphs show the equilibrium price before the subsidy. The home country on the left has a higher supply than demand at PW. So any excess supply will constitute an export supply. So this gap here is actually equal to this distance here. This gap here is equal to this gap here, and so on and so forth. So if the home country is exporting, then the foreign country is going to be importing. So at PW, the foreign country has a higher demand than supply. Again, the difference between the demand and the supply, the horizontal demand, will constitute the import demand, MD. When export supply and import demand meet, we obtain the equilibrium world price, PW, and the equilibrium world quantity, QW. Now, what is going on if we introduce a subsidy? If we introduce a subsidy, the export supply curve is going to shift downwards because for each unit sold abroad, the government is giving away an amount of money equal to S dollars or cents to the firms. Looking at the new equilibrium price, this is going to be P star S, where the new export supply curve meets the demand. Now, this is the price that is going to prevail abroad. So this is the price that foreign customers will pay when they import from the home country. However, firms are not subsidized on the goods they sell in the home market. So, at home, the price will actually be P star S plus S. So the price is lower for the foreign country thanks to the subsidy, but it is now higher in the home country. You can already imagine that home consumers are going to suffer from the export subsidy. Their surplus is going to decrease, whereas the surplus of producers is going to increase. They get to sell the good for a higher price in the home country, and they get to sell the good abroad for P star S, but they receive a subsidy S on each unit sold abroad, so overall they sell their good for a higher price. At the end of the day, between the home country and the foreign country, firms will perceive a price equal to P star S plus S. In the home country, it is simply imposed on consumers. In the foreign country, they sell the goods for P star S and they get S on top from the government. Now, let's look at how surpluses are going to evolve. Because since there is a subsidy, we also need to take into account the cost that the government is going to have to pay. So, first of all, these are the surpluses in the home country before an export subsidy. The price was equal to PW, for which we said the supply was bigger than the demand, and that's what makes exports. So the consumer surplus is going to be the blue triangle, and the producer surplus is going to be this red trapezoid. Now, the price in the home country is going to increase to P star S plus S. So producers will gain this much surplus, and consumers will lose this much surplus. Now we have to be careful about what the government is going to have to pay to the firms in the form of export subsidies. So, at this price, the consumer surplus is now lower. The producer surplus is now bigger. Now, we need to look at the total amount of goods being exported, and there is going to be a subsidy cost associated to that quantity. At this price, the difference between supply and demand here is what's going to constitute the exports. This quantity here is going to be the quantity that firms are going to export to the foreign country. The government is paying a subsidy equal to S for each of these units. So the difference between P star S plus S and P star S is equal to S. So this vertical bar here represents S, and there is one subsidy for each unit of the good, and that's how you obtain this yellow rectangle. But remember, this is not a revenue for the government, it is a cost. So this yellow rectangle is actually a negative surplus. Note that area B, D, and A overlap with the producer surplus. So these areas are going to cancel out. Area C is an area that used to not be any surplus, that was here, and now it represents a cost. So area C is a cost for the government. Now, what is the net effect? Well, the final effect is a deadweight loss equal to areas A plus C plus D. Let's look at it. If you compare both surpluses, B definitely was not surplus before. C was not surplus before. Okay. Now, area A used to be producer surplus, but now it is canceling out with this producer surplus. So here is the same as having a white area. So that's also a loss as opposed to the no subsidy case. And finally, D is going to cancel with this producer surplus. So area B used to be nothing, and now it is an area that cancels out with the producer surplus. So it is still a white area. D, A, and C, however, are net costs. Finally, the deadweight loss will then be D plus A plus C. Note that here there is no ambiguous effect. An export subsidy will unambiguously lead to a deadweight loss. In the lecture we saw that an import tariff might have a positive impact, a positive net increase in surplus, but that's not necessarily the case. But an export subsidy unambiguously leads to a deadweight loss. This is one of the reasons you do not see a lot of export subsidies, but you still see import tariffs. Now, let's go over the case of an import tariff, but let's change the type of economy we are looking at. There is a distinction to be made in international trade, the distinction between a small open economy or a big economy. The difference between the two is that one country has an impact on the world price because it is big enough, whereas the other is too small to impact the world price, so this will have an impact on the graphs. So, if we consider a small open economy, we are looking at a country that cannot influence the world price. So the export curve XS coming from foreign country is going to be horizontal because the world price will be taken as given for this small open economy. So we are going to obtain a graph of this kind. At PW, our home country is importing. This is why they impose an import tariff. The export supply curve is perfectly elastic. It's horizontal because a small open economy will take it as given and have no influence on it. The home country has its import demand, and where they meet, we obtain the world equilibrium, the world price PW and the world quantity QW. Now, let's impose a tariff on imports. So, as said in the lecture, a tariff on imports can also act as a tax on exports. This will shift the export supply curve upwards because now any country that wants to export will have to pay an additional price of T if it is exporting to the home country. The new equilibrium will be at this point here, but note that because the supply curve, the export supply curve is perfectly horizontal, the price went from PW to PW plus T. So the price, the world price, simply increased by the tax, the import tariff T. This is the price that home consumers are going to pay, but consumers in other countries will keep paying a price PW. Again, imposing a tariff by a small open economy will have no impact on the rest of the other countries. Other countries will still pay PW, but home consumers now are going to pay PW plus T. You can already imagine who is going to gain and who is going to lose surplus. Consumers are obviously losing surplus. They used to pay a price equal to PW. Now they have to pay a price equal to PW plus T. So they are going to lose this much. Producers used to sell at a price equal to PW. That would be their surplus. Now they have to sell at a price equal to PW plus T, but, well, they perceive this price from the home consumers, and this goes fully into their pocket. And on each, and so their surplus is going to increase. Finally, we need to take into account the government revenue. Now that the government is taxing imports, it is going to have a positive surplus. Let's look at it. Before the import tariff, the surpluses are as follows. Consumers enjoy this big surplus. Producers enjoy this much surplus. This is all they sell. Now, with a tax, the price goes to PW plus T. So consumer surplus is reduced. Producer surplus is increased. So producers are benefiting from the tariff because they can sell the product for a higher price in the home market. At this price, imports are going to be lower than what they used to be before. The government is taxing imports only. So, the government revenue will be equal to T, this distance, times the amount that is imported. At this price, consumers are going to import an amount equal to the difference between the demand here and the supply. So area B is going to be the government revenue. Now, let's add up all the surpluses and compare with the no import tariff case. Here we are all the way down to PW. Now we are at PW plus T, and you can see that there are three areas A, B, and C, that used to belong to the consumer surplus. Now, area A and C are no surplus at all, and area B is government surplus. Producers gained this much surplus over consumers, so there is no net effect. What they gained here was lost by consumers. So the overall net effect is, when you add everything together, area A and C used to be consumer surplus. Now they are nothing at all. Area B is part of positive surplus, so it replaces some of the lost consumer surplus. The net effect is then a deadweight loss equal to A plus C. Note that now the deadweight loss is unambiguously positive. There is a loss no matter what. So, because the country is too small to influence the world price, what is going to happen after imposing a tariff is the price home consumers are going to pay is simply going to increase from PW, the world price, to PW plus T. They fully absorb the tax, the tariff, because the export supply is infinitely elastic. Sounds a lot like what we saw in tax incidents. The government will make some revenue, but overall, there's going to be more surplus lost than under the no import tariff case. This is explained by the fact that the price in the home country does not increase by the amount of the tariff in a large country, because the tariff changes the new world price. Same as a subsidy. If you look at a subsidy a bit above, you can see that the new price is equal to P star S plus S, but P star S plus S is not PW plus S. Some of the subsidy was absorbed by the supply, by the export supply. So the new price is not just the old price plus S. It is a bit lower than the old price plus S. In the case of a small open economy, the export supply curve is perfectly elastic. And remember that when it's perfectly elastic, the other side of the market is going to fully absorb the effect of the tax. The tax burden falls on consumers entirely. If you are a small open economy, this model says that you should not impose an import tariff on goods coming from abroad. It might help if you are a big country, as in you can protect your industry. If you are a small open economy, overall you're going to make more pain than gain. There will be a gain for firms, of course. Firms get to sell their good for a higher price. Their surplus increased by this much. But the consumer surplus decreased too much relative to the increase in producer surplus and the government revenue. International trade is a fascinating topic that helps us understand why countries trade with each other, why they trade what they trade. It's an extremely rich field that tries to explain all kinds of trade patterns. They look at the effect of taxes, subsidies. They look at the effect of trade wars. So you can also mix a bit of game theory in this field. You can look at it from a microeconomic perspective, if you think about a firm trying to export, or from a macroeconomic perspective, when you think about an overall country trying to export or import. It has very different implications in terms of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and so on. And with the world we are currently living in, inputs are more and more mobile. Most countries know English. It's not necessarily the official language, but by now English is the business language, is the world's language. So anybody can go work anywhere. Capital is a harder thing to move. After all, it's hard to move a warehouse to the other side of the world. But things are also rapidly evolving, as in, with the COVID-19 pandemic, more and more jobs happen remotely. So you could be working for a Canadian company from your home in France, India, China, Germany, wherever. And we also need to take into account the fact that countries are more and more interdependent, as trade settles, they are relying on their trade partners to get specific goods. If aggregate risks hit the world in the same way, such as a pandemic, then you can see how many countries ended up in a pinch because they were not producing the necessary equipment to protect themselves from the pandemic, and the biggest producers in the world could not keep the pace and provide such quantities to everybody right away. That's how you ended up with some countries like France having delays in providing basic masks, protective and sanitary equipment to their population, and maybe also how vaccines took a long time to deploy. That's it for this tutorial on international trade. Have a good rest of your week and see you in the next one. Bye.